Why did anti-imperialists oppose annexing Philippines? Because it was already democratic? No, it wasn't. Because we were making a colony? Yes. Because Europe could rule it better? No. Because anti-imperialists were pro-Spain? No. Any questions about imperialism in this time period? Okay. Gentleman's agreement was, why did Roosevelt make California take Japanese kids in school? So in San Francisco, the school board ruled that Japanese kids couldn't go to school with white kids anymore. They had to go to Japanese segregated schools. And the Japanese American community were most unhappy. The Japanese government was most unhappy. So they began to put pressure on Teddy to do something, or they threatened to cut off American trading rights with Japan. So Teddy reached an agreement with the government of Japan that he would make sure that Japanese kids were not discriminated in American schools as long as Japan promised to do what?
Keep more.
What?
Keep more.
Right, to stop Japanese immigration into America. Okay? The Roosevelt Corollary, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine says to Europe, the Western Hemisphere is ours. You cannot recolonize. This was in 1823, after Spain had been disinherited of all of its possessions with the exception of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Roosevelt Corollary said to Europe, if you have an issue with a Western Hemisphere country, we'll solve it for you. We'll be the policeman, we'll be the banker. Okay, if Venezuela owes you, Britain, money, you, Britain, cannot go in and take over the customs houses and collect taxes until you're paid back. We'll go take over the customs house in Venezuela and get your money for you. Okay? So the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, was to keep Europe out, protect American interests. Why did the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt Corollary keep Europe out? Because it A, helped the Spanish Navy, it had B, helped the British Navy, C, it's because of the strength of the American economy and military, D, Latin America's weak economy and military, or the last one, conflict between Russia and France. I don't think that the kids remembered this real correctly, but the strength of American economy and military would be the right answer. By the time the Roosevelt Corollary is issued about 1903, the United States is being recognized as being an economic as well as a military power. We'll solidify our rank as a military power once and for all with World War I. We'll show that we can compete with the big boys. In fact, not only compete, but help the big boys win. Okay? Open door policy, or Hayes' open door no, was in regards to what country? China. Hayes sends a letter to Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and says, hey guys, we'll let you trade at our harbor of Canton without any problems if we can trade in your harbors like Hong Kong, for instance. The only people who write Hayes back are the Russians. They say, yeah, good idea, okay? Because they're in the same kind of semi-weak position we are. And then what occurs in China? The Boxer Rebellion. And the nativist Chinese want to get rid of all the foreign influence. They want to get rid of Christianity. And so they begin to put, to try to take back their country. It takes all the allies together, sending troops in to get the Boxer Rebellion put down. So everybody agrees to let European and American interests, trading interests, exist in China. Okay, any questions about any of that? Booker T. Washington called for self-help for African Americans, meaning his thing with the Atlantic Compromise or Expedition, which is the next one, was that blacks should show their worth economically, and then whites would give them rights like voting rights and get rid of Jim Crow laws, that kind of thing. Okay? He believed that it would be a slow process, but eventually whites would see the light. Washington, the question was, who was the most influential African American leader in 1900? Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, W.B. Du Bois, Jesse Jackson, Frederick Douglass. Okay? Well, by 1900, Frederick Douglass is dead. Jesse Jackson isn't even alive. So that leaves you with Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and the peanut chemist, George Washington Carver. Okay? So it really leaves you between Du Bois and Washington. Remember that Washington is the one who Teddy Roosevelt invites to the White House for dinner. Okay? Secondly, remember that W.B. Du Bois does not really come to national prominence until after the formation of what organization? NAACP, which is not until 1909. Okay? So Du Bois's influence is really more the teens and the 20s, by which time Booker T. Washington's an old man and maybe even dead. I'd have to look up when he died. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, said separate is equal. Okay? It justified or allowed Jim Crow segregation, which was legalized segregation in the South. Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in 1954 by what case? Brown versus the Board of Education. Okay? What didn't put blacks into an inferior position after the Civil War? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Virtually everything else that you could name put blacks into an inferior position. Poll taxes, literacy tests, black codes, Jim Crow laws, Ku Klux Klan. I mean, you start naming them and everything tries to put blacks into an inferior position except the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay? Purpose of the NAACP to fight in court for civil rights. Oh, I skipped W.B. Du Bois, I'm sorry. W.B. Du Bois's belief, his influence, he stressed education and equality. He said, it is bunk to sit around and wait for whites to see the light. We have to go out and actively seek our civil rights and force the issue. We should demand and be given equal educational opportunities. We should demand and be given equal equality rights, the right to vote, the right to hold office, whatever. Okay? So, purpose of NAACP here did changes in civil, I think it should be civil rights after Reconstruction. The changes are they lost civil rights after Reconstruction. No longer was there an army around to make sure blacks were allowed to vote. Now there are poll taxes and literacy tests, so they're not allowed to vote. Jim Crow laws are put into place. So those black codes that the Union Army kept at bay with the 14th Amendment are suddenly ignored, and they institute Jim Crow laws, and the courts back it up because the United States government at that time was not willing to make an issue out of segregation. Which African American leader demanded immediate economic and social equality for them? W.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells Barnett, A. Philip Randolph, Booker T. Washington, or George Washington Carver. W.B. Du Bois. Ida Wells Barnett was the progressive who wrote about anti-lynching. Okay, Barnett is the anti-lynching person. A. Philip Randolph is really the 1930s. He's the head of the Porters Union. He says to Franklin Roosevelt, either you start including blacks in the New Deal or I'm going to bring 100,000 angry blacks to Washington to protest. And Mr. Roosevelt opened up some programs in the New Deal. Booker T. Washington obviously did not demand immediate economic and social equality. And George Washington Carver was just interested in coming up with the millionth and one thing to do with peanuts. Jim Crow defined it as legalized segregation. The impact of it is that it puts blacks into an inferior position. It forces them into that yes sir, no sir kind of role.